Picture this. It's April 7th, 2026, Easter Sunday.
Right.
Millions of Christians all over the world are just, gathered with their families. It's supposed to be this day dedicated to resurrection, hope, peace, just a quiet Sunday morning.
Yeah, a day of global calm, really.
Exactly. But right in the middle of that calm, the President of the United States posts this incredibly public ultimatum on social media, and it's directed squarely at Iran.
We have to remember, this is a nation with a continuous history going back, 7,000 years?
Yeah, literally the cradle of mathematics and astronomy, the
Yeah.
place where Cyrus the Great carved the world's very first human rights charter into a clay cylinder.
Right. So the message the U.S. president sends them isn't, some standard diplomatic warning drafted by a bunch of cautious State Department officials.
No, not at all. It was, I'm going to read the translated text from our source material verbatim here. The president wrote, "Open the strait or your whole civilization will die tonight."
Wow. Your whole civilization will die tonight. The gravity of those 7 words is just staggering.
It really is. It's not just a threat of a targeted strike.
Right. It's not a limited military engagement. It's completely apocalyptic. It's literally the language of total existential erasure.
And that terrifying standoff is exactly what we are unpacking today. We've got this massive stack of sources in front of us. It's a comprehensive, translated intelligence and historical breakdown detailing this whole 2026 escalation between the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is to basically unravel this incredibly complex web of history, the high-stakes economics, and honestly, the pure existential dread driving the conflict.
Because we want to look way past the sensational headlines, we need to understand the physical mechanics of the world's most critical oceanic choke point.
Definitely. And we also have to look at the deep historical trauma that, essentially hardwires Iranian policy.
Yeah. Right. And perhaps most importantly, we need to uncover this massive emerging threat to the U.S. petrodollar system that forced the United States to even consider the unthinkable.
But before we dive into the mechanics of all this, we should probably establish some ground rules for how we're analyzing this intelligence breakdown.
Oh, absolutely. That's super important.
Because the source material we're working with today contains some highly charged political rhetoric.
Oh, yeah. Extreme actions, very severe statements from U.S. political figures across the entire spectrum.
Right, both left-wing and right-wing, as well as the highest levels of leadership in Israel and Iran.
So, as your guides through this really intense material, we are maintaining a strict analytical distance.
We're not taking sides.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting on these viewpoints, the military strategies, all these explosive statements, purely to help you, the listener, understand the source material.
Right, we are not endorsing any side, any politician, or any military action.
Our job is simply to convey the ideas contained in these original documents. We just want to figure out exactly how the world arrived at this Easter Sunday ultimatum.
Because a threat of civilization-ending violence, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, it's the boiling point of a geopolitical chess match that spans 70 years.
Yeah, and to understand the immediate trigger, we have to look at the physical location that sparked the fuse. It's a profoundly small, incredibly vital geographic feature.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz. Why is a tiny strip of water worth risking World War III?
People always say geography is destiny, but when you look at the physical reality of this strait, it takes on a terrifying weight.
It really does. We're talking about a waterway between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and then eventually out to the open Arabian Sea.
And at its absolute narrowest point, the strait is only 34 kilometers wide.
Which is, for context, 34 kilometers is basically a typical suburban commute.
Yeah, you could drive across that space on a clear highway in, 25 minutes?
Exactly, but the actual navigable space for ships is far, far smaller than that.
Wait, really? Why is that?
Because the water in that 34-kilometer gap isn't all deep enough for massive supertankers.
Oh, right. Because a fully loaded, very large crude carrier, a VLCC, weighs hundreds of thousands of tons.
Yeah, they sit incredibly deep in the water, so if they stray from the absolute deepest channels, they'll just run aground.
So how wide are the actual shipping lanes then?
They're only 3 kilometers wide in either direction.
Wow, just 3 kilometers.
Yep. You have a 3-kilometer inbound lane, a 3-kilometer outbound lane, and a 2-kilometer beefer zone separating them so they don't crash head-on.
That is the entire bottleneck for the whole region.
And through that tiny maritime window passes literally the lifeblood of the modern industrial world. The intelligence data here is staggering.
Yeah, it says 20% of the world's total crude oil flows through those 3 kilometers.
20%. And add to that 20% of the global liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
Right. I mean, just look at a map of the Persian Gulf. You've got Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain.
These nations hold the largest, most easily extractable oil and gas reserves on the entire planet.
But those reserves are essentially locked inside a giant bathtub.
Yeah.
And the Strait of Hormuz is the only drain.
That's a great way to put it. To get that energy to power plants in Europe or factories in Asia, it absolutely must pass through Hormuz.
We are looking at roughly 18 to 20 million barrels of oil moving through that tiny corridor every single day.
Imagine you live in this massive, sprawling, wealthy, gated community. Hundreds of homes, beautiful lawns, all that.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Everyone in this community relies on a daily fleet of delivery trucks bringing in food, water, and fuel just to survive. But the entire community only has one entrance.
And it's not some big multi-lane highway, right?
Exactly. It's a single-lane dirt driveway. If a delivery truck breaks down in that driveway, or if someone deliberately parks a bulldozer across it, the entire community starves within days.
That is the Strait of Hormuz, perfectly explained. It is the world's most critical single-lane driveway.
And if the flow stops, the modern world basically goes dark.
But the crucial variable in that analogy is who lives right next to that dirt driveway.
Right. Iran sits on the entire northern coast of the strait. For hundreds of miles, Iranian territory overlooks this bottleneck.
And this is vital to understand. Iran does not need a sophisticated blue water navy to control the strait.
Let's define that real quick for the listener. A blue water navy means a maritime force capable of operating globally, across deep oceans.
Like aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, massive destroyers projecting power thousands of miles from home.
Yeah, the U.S. obviously has the premier blue water navy.
Precisely. But Iran doesn't have that, and honestly, they don't need it.
Because they operate in what we call a brown water or green water environment. They fight in their own coastal puddles.
Right, to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, they basically just need to stand on their own porch and throw rocks.
Only, in this case, the rocks are thousands of highly sophisticated naval mines.
And anti-ship cruise missiles hidden in coastal caves, plus fleets of heavily armed speedboats.
And our sources detail exactly the catastrophic chain of events that unfolded when Iran decided to completely close that driveway in 2026.
Following some extreme escalations, Iran essentially hit the mute button on the global economy.
And they didn't even have to physically sink every single oil tanker attempting the crossing.
Right. The goal wasn't total destruction. The goal was psychological and economic paralysis.
They deployed naval mines into the shipping lanes. They launched targeted drone attacks against commercial tankers.
And they used fast attack speedboats to aggressively swarm and intimidate these massive, slow-moving cargo ships.
They just had to make the water so incredibly dangerous that the perception of risk skyrocketed.
Because the mechanics of global shipping are entirely governed by insurance.
Oh, yeah. Every one of those massive oil tankers is insured for hundreds of millions of dollars.
And the cargo they carry is worth hundreds of millions more.
So the moment the risk of a missile strike or a mine becomes too high, what happens?
The massive insurance syndicates in London and New York, places like Lloyd's, they do something very simple. They designate the Persian Gulf a war risk area, and they pull their coverage.
Or they raise the premiums so astronomically high that it just becomes economically impossible to sail.
Exactly. Without insurance, the massive global shipping operators simply will not send a vessel into a war zone. The waters empty out instantly.
And the economic shockwave outlined in these sources is almost unfathomable.
Because the strait was effectively barricaded by these asymmetric tactics, right?
Yeah. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, they suddenly had nowhere to send their oil.
The oil was still pumping out of the ground, but the storage facilities quickly filled up.
And once the storage is full and the ships aren't arriving, you have to turn off the tap.
They were forced to just halt production. We were talking about 7.5 million barrels of daily production simply shut in.
And by April 2026, the documents show that number rising to a terrifying deficit of 9.1 million barrels a day.
Taking 9 million barrels of oil off the global market overnight, that is the equivalent of an economic heart attack.
It totally eclipses the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s.
It is the largest single-event oil supply disruption in human history.
But, this isn't just a political problem for Washington or a logistical nightmare for shipping magnates.
No, this is a profound, immediate problem for your wallet. When those ships stop moving near Oman, the ripple effect hits your hometown in days.
According to the intelligence breakdown, this event immediately sent the average price of U.S. gasoline spiking to $4.30 per gallon.
With regions like California obviously seeing much higher numbers, the global benchmark, Brent crude, skyrocketed toward $90 a barrel.
Which dictates the basic mechanics of daily life. It dictates the price of your morning commute.
Right, the diesel fuel powering the massive trucks that deliver produce and meat to your local supermarket spikes in cost.
Which means the grocery stores instantly raise the prices of your food to compensate. It triggers a massive wave of global inflation.
And while wealthy nations struggle with inflation, developing nations face outright collapse.
Yeah, in places like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, a sudden doubling of energy costs creates an immediate, devastating crisis.
Governments default, rolling blackouts become the absolute norm.
In Europe, already strained by years of energy volatility, winter heating bills explode.
The U.S. Energy Information Administration literally had to issue warnings that prices would simply continue to rise indefinitely until the strait reopened.
Iran, merely by sitting on the northern coast and threatening the water, proved they hold the remote control to global inflation.
Which raises this massive, glaring question.
Why? Right. If Iran closes the strait, they also cut off their own ability to sell oil.
Exactly. And they risk bringing the full, catastrophic wrath of the United States military down upon their heads.
So to understand why Iran is willing to choke the global economy, to risk total annihilation today, we have to put down the map of 2026 and look backward.
We have to examine a wound inflicted over 70 years ago.
The intelligence documents make it abundantly clear. You absolutely cannot understand the decisions of 2026 without understanding the trauma of 1953.
The ghosts of 1953. Political scientists often talk about institutional memory.
Right. Humans might live for 80 years, but institutions, governments, intelligence agencies, they possess memories that span centuries.
They remember the exact moments they were betrayed, and they build their entire modern defensive postures around ensuring it never happens again.
So let's set the stage for Iran in 1951. At this time, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh.
He's a really fascinating, complex figure, a Harvard-educated nationalist known for his fiery speeches.
And his absolute devotion to Iranian sovereignty. Mossadegh had this very simple, incredibly popular dream. He believed that the staggering wealth generated by Iran's oil should actually belong to the people of Iran.
Which, from the perspective of any sovereign nation, that logic is unassailable. You have the resource, you should reap the benefit.
But at that time, Iran's massive oil wealth was completely controlled by the British.
Specifically, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is the massive corporate entity that eventually rebranded and became BP.
British Petroleum. Under the existing agreements, the British were extracting millions of barrels of oil, keeping the vast majority of the profits.
And essentially paying Iran a tiny royalty while treating Iranian oil workers appallingly.
So in 1951, Mossadegh and the Iranian parliament did the unthinkable for a developing nation in the post-colonial era.
They voted to nationalize the oil industry.
They essentially kicked the British executives out, took over the refineries, and declared, "This resource belongs to the Iranian people. We will manage it."
And as the historical breakdown notes, Britain was absolutely furious. Winston Churchill's government saw this not just as a loss of revenue, but as a fatal blow to British prestige.
So they launched a massive pressure campaign, diplomatic isolation, severe economic sanctions, a global naval blockade to prevent anyone from buying Iranian oil.
But the economic strangulation wasn't enough to break Mossadegh's popular support.
So Britain turned to the United States. They went to the Eisenhower administration and asked for help to remove him.
And this decision represents one of the most critical forks in the road of modern history.
The trajectory of the entire Middle East was forever altered by what Washington decided to do next.
The CIA, operating under Alan Dulles, teamed up with the British MI6 to launch a covert action.
The code name was Operation Ajax, executed in the summer of 1953.
The mechanics of this, as detailed in the historical breakdown, are chilling because of how insidious they were.
It wasn't an invasion. There were no U.S. Marines storming the beaches.
Right. It was an orchestrated, manufactured subversion from the inside out, largely coordinated by a CIA operative named Kermit Roosevelt.
The CIA and MI6 basically just flooded Tehran with cash.
They organized and paid for massive, violent street protests, hiring local gangs to roam the streets to create this illusion of anarchy.
And they systematically corrupted the Iranian media, paying newspaper editors to print wild, fabricated anti-Mossadegh propaganda.
They even bribed high-ranking military officers and key figures in the Tehran bazaar to turn against the government.
They essentially engineered a state of total societal chaos to make it look like the country was collapsing under democratic rule.
Providing a perfectly tailored pretext for a military takeover to restore order.
And their manufactured chaos worked perfectly. On August 19, 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown by the military.
The democratically elected leader, the man who tried to secure his nation's wealth for his people, was arrested, tried for treason, and spent the rest of his life locked under house arrest until he died.
And in his place, the United States and Britain reinstated a monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
The Shah was brought back to absolute power for one primary reason. He was highly compliant to Western interests.
And crucially, very friendly to Western oil companies.
The divergence in how this event is remembered is just staggering today.
Yeah, if you ask an American or British policymaker today about 1953, they'll likely just dismiss it.
They'll say, well, that was the height of the Cold War. We were terrified Mossadegh might align with the Soviet Union. It was a long time ago.
The world has moved on, right?
But if you examine the psychological profile of the modern Iranian leadership, 1953 is not ancient history. It happened yesterday morning.
It is viewed as the original sin of the West. It birthed a permanent, lingering trauma.
Operation Ajax proved to the Iranian psyche that the West does not actually care about democracy, human rights, or sovereignty. They only care about compliance and controlling resources.
This event is the exact, literal genesis of the United States being labeled the Great Satan, the great deceiver who will smile at you while paying a mob to burn down your house.
Wow, yeah.
But I understand the history, but I have to push back a little bit here. I want to play devil's advocate. We are talking about a grievance from over 70 years ago. Does a covert operation from the 1950s truly dictate modern military strategy involving drones and cyber warfare in 2026?
It's a fair question.
Or is 1953 just a highly convenient, emotionally resonant excuse for the current authoritarian regime in Tehran to hold on to power, suppress their own people, and justify their aggression?
That is the essential million-dollar question. It is the debate at the heart of Western intelligence analysis.
So what's the answer?
The answer is that the trauma of 1953 wasn't just a one-off event that ended when Mossadegh was arrested. The trauma became a continuous, daily, brutal reality for the Iranian people for the next 25 years. You have to trace the direct, unbroken line from the 1953 CIA coup to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Because the Shah, whom the United States installed and heavily backed, he didn't rule as a benevolent constitutional monarch.
No, he ruled as an absolute dictator. The sources highlight the terrifying nature of his secret police, the Savak.
Savak was infamous, and they were trained with the assistance of the CIA and Israeli intelligence.
They were tasked with crushing any form of political opposition, whether it was from secular leftists, democratic reformers, or religious clerics.
We are talking about widespread, documented torture, electric shocks, beatings, massive censorship, arbitrary imprisonment,
and assassinations of anyone who spoke out against the Shah's policies.
The Iranian people lived under a daily regime of terror that was openly backed, funded, and armed to the teeth by Washington.
So when you ask if 1953 is just an excuse, you have to realize that millions of Iranians lived with the physical bleeding consequences of that American decision every single day of their lives until 1979.
Which eventually causes the pressure cooker to explode entirely.
Precisely. You cannot suppress a population forever. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution succeeds.
The Shah, dying of cancer, flees the country. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns from exile in Paris to a hero's welcome.
And he takes over, establishing a fiercely anti-Western Islamic Republic.
And the very first geopolitical shift that occurs is the permanent, violent severing of ties with the West.
The Iranian oil industry is nationalized again, this time permanently, locking out Western companies from a nation sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves.
Reserves estimated today at 155 billion barrels, by the way.
And the trauma response gets violent. Because the U.S. decided to admit the exiled Shah into America for medical treatment, the Iranian paranoia flared up.
They believed the U.S. was plotting a second Operation Ajax.
This is when radical Iranian student groups storm the United States Embassy in Tehran. They take 52 Americans hostage, blindfold them, parade them on television.
And hold them captive for 444 agonizing days. That is the moment where the U.S.-Iran relationship shatters into a million irreparable pieces.
The United States goes from having its absolute strongest, most heavily armed ally in the Middle East to facing its most bitter, ideologically driven enemy.
But the timeline of trauma, the cementing of the Iranian worldview, doesn't even stop there.
Right. Immediately following the chaos of the revolution, in 1980, Saddam Hussein sees weakness in Iran.
He sees an army purged of its generals. So Iraq invades Iran.
The Iran-Iraq War becomes an apocalyptic 8-year bloodbath, lasting from 1980 to 1988.
It resembled World War I, complete with horrific trench warfare and massive artillery barrages.
And the United States supported Saddam Hussein during this invasion.
Heavily and knowingly. Despite the fact that Saddam was the aggressor, the United States saw him as a useful tool to bleed the new Islamic Republic.
The U.S. provided Iraq with critical battlefield intelligence, economic aid, and agricultural credits.
And most damningly, the international community, led by the West, largely looked the other way while Saddam systematically used chemical weapons.
Mustard gas and nerve agents like sarin against Iranian troops and civilians.
Hundreds of thousands of Iranians died in that horrific conflict. But Iran refused to surrender.
They absorbed the chemical strikes, launched massive, devastating human wave attacks using lightly armed volunteers, and fought Saddam to a bloody, exhausted standstill.
The takeaway for the Iranian leadership from that 8-year meat grinder was singular, absolute, and defining.
Survival at all costs.
Exactly. The worldview is, the world is fundamentally against us. The United Nations and international law will not protect us from chemical slaughter. The West will actively arm our neighbors to destroy us.
Therefore, we can only rely on ourselves, and we must become so strategically stubborn and deeply entrenched that we can outlast any siege.
Survival at all costs. That is the defining mantra.
If your entire modern national identity is forged in the fires of being overthrown by the CIA, tortured by a U.S.-backed monarch's secret police, and gassed by Western-supported neighbors, you're going to seek the ultimate insurance policy.
You're not going to trust pieces of paper or diplomatic promises.
No, you are going to build a shield that absolutely no one on Earth can pierce. You're going to build a nuclear program.
The nuclear shield. When we look at this through the cold, calculating lens of modern statecraft, there is a very brutal, undeniable logic at play.
It's what intelligence analysts sometimes refer to as the Gaddafi or Assad rule.
It is a harsh observation of how the West treats adversarial regimes based entirely on their nuclear status.
Explain the mechanics of that rule, because it sets a terrifying precedent for global proliferation.
Well, look at the fate of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. He was a dictator with a nascent, developing nuclear program. In 2003, after seeing the U.S. invade Iraq, he got terrified.
So he agreed to a deal with the West to completely dismantle his nuclear ambitions.
He handed over his centrifuges, his blueprints, everything, believing that this concession would buy him peace, security, and integration into the global economic community.
And it worked for a while.
It did. But 8 years later, in 2011, when a domestic uprising started in Libya during the Arab Spring, Western powers, the very same powers he made the deal with, launched a massive military intervention.
That NATO air campaign destroyed his military and led directly to Gaddafi being dragged through the streets and killed by a mob.
The lesson there is abundantly clear.
Yeah.
Give up your nukes and you lose your only real leverage against destruction.
Now look at Syria's Bashar al-Assad. He attempted to build a nuclear reactor in secret with North Korean help, but it was destroyed by an Israeli airstrike in 2007.
Right, he never fully built a nuclear arsenal. Consequently, when the Syrian civil war broke out, his country was decimated, partially invaded by multiple neighboring nations, and heavily bombed by Western and regional air forces.
He survived only due to massive Russian intervention, but his sovereignty was shattered.
And the contrast to those two is North Korea.
Yeah, you have a regime in Pyongyang that is incredibly isolated, economically impoverished, human rights abusing, and openly, loudly antagonistic to the West.
But they have a tested, proven, robust nuclear arsenal and ballistic missiles.
And because of that, nobody invades North Korea. Nobody launches a regime change war to topple Kim Jong-un. The deterrent holds.
The pattern is painfully clear to the strategists in Tehran. Nuclear capability equals regime survival.
No superpower initiates a ground invasion or a decapitation strike against a nation holding a nuclear bomb. The risk of losing a city is simply too high.
So Iran began heavily investing in enriching uranium.
Now, officially, their diplomatic stance has always been that the program is strictly for civilian use to generate electricity and create medical isotopes.
But Western and Israeli intelligence have continually claimed, with substantial evidence of hidden facilities and military ties, that Iran is seeking the technical capability to build a nuclear weapon.
And the mechanics of this nuclear ambition led to a massive, decade-long diplomatic roller coaster known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Which the media usually just calls the Iran nuclear deal.
Our sources track this timeline meticulously, and the math of enrichment is crucial here. Natural uranium dug out of the ground has less than 1% of the highly radioactive U-235 isotope.
To use it, you have to spin it in thousands of high-tech centrifuges to separate and concentrate the U-235.
Right. And in 2015, the Obama administration, alongside the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China, managed to strike a historic deal with Iran.
Iran agreed to strictly limit its uranium enrichment to 3.67%.
Which is perfect for running a civilian power plant, but it is incredibly far below the roughly 90% purity needed to build a nuclear warhead.
Furthermore, Iran agreed to allow regular, highly intrusive, unannounced inspections by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to verify compliance.
And in exchange for capping their enrichment and submitting to inspections, the crushing web of international economic sanctions was lifted.
Over $100 billion of Iran's frozen international assets were finally unfrozen.
They were allowed to openly sell their oil on the global market again and reconnect to the international banking system.
The Obama administration and the European allies viewed this as a monumental diplomatic breakthrough.
It essentially put Iran's nuclear weapons potential in a deeply frozen box, preventing a nuclear arms race in the volatile Middle East without firing a single shot.
But the roller coaster plunges off the tracks in 2018.
Yeah, Donald Trump, having assumed the presidency, fundamentally disagreed with the premise of the deal. He fulfills a campaign promise and officially withdraws the United States from the JCPOA.
His argument, which was heavily supported by Israel and Saudi Arabia, was that the agreement was the worst deal ever.
Because it only delayed the nuclear timeline temporarily, and more importantly, it ignored Iran's conventional ballistic missile program.
Furthermore, Trump argued that lifting the sanctions just handed Iran billions of dollars in cash that they immediately used to fund terrorist proxy groups across the region.
So the U.S. exits the deal and institutes a maximum pressure campaign.
And the mechanics of maximum pressure were designed to absolutely crush the Iranian economy through secondary sanctions.
The U.S. essentially told the rest of the world, you can either do business with the United States or you can do business with Iran. Choose.
Given the size of the U.S. economy, every major corporation and bank abandoned Iran. The results in Tehran were devastating.
The Iranian currency, the rial, completely collapsed in value.
Inflation hit 40 to 50%, wiping out the savings of the middle class. Youth unemployment skyrocketed.
But, and this is the critical intelligence takeaway, the economic strangulation did not stop the nuclear enrichment.
No. In fact, freed from the legal obligations of the JCPOA, Iran retaliated by turning the centrifuges back on at full speed.
By 2023, the IAEA reported with alarm that Iran was enriching uranium to 60% purity.
And to an outside observer, going from 60% to 90% seems like a big leap.
But the physics of enrichment are nonlinear. The hardest, most time-consuming part is going from natural ore to 20%.
Right. Once you have a stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, you have done 99% of the actual work.
Getting from 60 to the 90% weapons-grade threshold requires very little time and effort.
Precisely. They had reached what nuclear experts call breakout capacity.
Meaning, if the supreme leader made the political decision today to build a bomb, they had the technical capability, the advanced centrifuges, and the highly enriched material to do so in a matter of months or possibly even weeks.
The shield was almost complete.
Which sets the stage for an incredibly tense, paranoid standoff. The U.S. is squeezing the economy, Iran is spinning the centrifuges faster.
And right in the middle of this boiling tension, we get a massive kinetic escalation that nearly sparks a war on its own.
January 3rd, 2020, the assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani.
This strike was a seismic shock to the entire Middle Eastern system. Soleimani was not just a general.
No, he was the commander of the Quds Force, the elite, secretive external operations division of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
In terms of power and influence within Iran, he was arguably second only to the supreme leader himself.
He was essentially the mastermind, the architect of Iran's entire foreign policy and asymmetric military strategy in the region.
The sources refer to him as the builder of the axis of resistance.
Because Iran's conventional military is outdated, Soleimani built a network of deeply loyal, highly armed proxy militias.
He was the guy funding, arming, training, and organizing Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and various powerful Shia militias in Iraq and Syria.
To the United States and Israel, Soleimani was a master terrorist, directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers via improvised explosive devices in Iraq.
But to the Iranian public, he was a towering, almost mythological national hero who defeated ISIS and projected Iranian power.
And the United States took him out with a precision drone strike just as his convoy was leaving the Baghdad International Airport.
The Iranian response was one of absolute fury. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets in massive weeping crowds mourning him, chanting "Death to America."
The Iranian government hoisted a red flag of revenge over a major mosque and promised severe, crushing retaliation.
And they did retaliate. They fired a massive barrage of ballistic missiles directly at Al-Assad Air Base and another facility in Iraq that housed U.S. troops.
This was the largest ballistic missile attack ever launched against American forces. But the sources highlight a truly fascinating, deeply revealing detail about this retaliation.
Yeah, Iran provided advance warning.
They deliberately tipped off the Iraqi government hours before the missiles launched, knowing with absolute certainty that the message would immediately be passed to the American commanders.
Think about how bizarre that is on the surface.
Seriously, if you are trying to exact severe revenge for the assassination of your top, most beloved general, why on earth would you intentionally warn the enemy so they have time to get all their soldiers into reinforced bunkers?
Because it perfectly illustrates the core strategy we discussed. Survival at all costs.
Right.
Iran knows, with cold mathematical certainty, that it cannot win a direct conventional full-scale war against the United States.
A head-to-head military confrontation with American air and naval power would result in the utter destruction of their infrastructure and the likely collapse of the regime.
But domestically, they had to respond.
Right.
They had to save face and project strength to their own furious population and their regional proxies.
So they fire the missiles, a spectacular, undeniable, highly televised use of state force that destroys buildings and airplanes.
But they intentionally ensure that American casualties are minimal, specifically to avoid provoking an all-out U.S. invasion.
It is the ultimate display of calculated restraint. They walked right up to the edge of the cliff, looked down, and carefully stepped back.
Their true power does not lie in a conventional clash of armies. It lies in asymmetric warfare.
It lies in the proxy militias Soleimani spent decades building.
Exactly. It lies in being a constant bleeding thorn in the side of their enemies, inflicting 1,000 small cuts without ever giving the United States a clear, undeniable justification to launch a regime-ending war.
But that strategy relies on patience. And patience runs out when the math changes.
Creeping toward that 90% nuclear enrichment line? That was a bridge too far for the West and Israel.
Which brings us to the terrifying summer of 2025. This is where the timeline in our intelligence breakdown accelerates wildly.
Iran's steady, undeniable creep toward full nuclear breakout capacity triggered a massive preemptive kinetic response that completely rewrote the Middle Eastern chessboard.
We are looking at the execution of Operation Midnight Hammer, launched in June 2025.
The sources detail an unprecedented combined United States and Israeli military strike directly on sovereign Iranian soil.
And they didn't just hit a radar dish or a border outpost. They targeted Iran's most prized, heavily fortified, deeply buried underground nuclear facilities.
We are talking about Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, the crown jewels of the Iranian atomic program.
The facility at Fordow, for instance, is built deep inside a mountain specifically to withstand aerial bombardment. Taking it out requires dropping massive 30,000-pound bunker buster munitions that penetrate solid rock before detonating.
The execution of Midnight Hammer plunges the entire region into what the intelligence community dubbed the 12-day war.
It was a chaotic, terrifying explosion of violence. Iran responds by activating its proxies and firing salvos of ballistic missiles and suicide drones directly at Israel.
Israel defends itself utilizing its multi-layered air defense systems, like the Iron Dome and David's Sling. But the sheer volume of incoming fire means some missiles inevitably leak through, striking population centers.
In the shadows, Iranian nuclear scientists are targeted for assassination. Top IRGC military commanders are killed in precision strikes.
It is a full-blown regional exchange of heavy fire.
And what makes this period so incredibly dangerous is the profound fog of war that descends over the aftermath of Midnight Hammer.
The sources highlight the wildly conflicting narratives broadcast to the world.
On one side, Donald Trump holds a press conference claiming absolute victory. He asserts that the U.S. and Israeli bunker busters completely obliterated the Iranian nuclear program, setting them back decades.
But on the other side, Iranian state media officially denies any significant strategic damage.
They broadcast footage of intact centrifuges, claiming their most vital, deeply buried underground halls survived the assault.
And the one organization that could actually verify the truth, the IAEA, is completely locked out.
Following the strikes, Iran expels the remaining inspectors and blinds the monitoring cameras. They have zero access.
So the global intelligence community is essentially flying blind, relying entirely on satellite imagery to try and guess if the nuclear threat was actually neutralized and the centrifuges destroyed.
Or if the hornet's nest was just kicked violently without killing the hornets.
Exactly.
But while the world is debating the status of the centrifuges, the intelligence breakdown reveals that the most critical casualty of the 12-day war wasn't a machine.
It was the leadership.
During the chaos and immense stress of the summer of 2025, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei died.
The death of Khamenei at that specific moment is almost impossible to overstate in its strategic impact.
He had ruled Iran with an absolute iron fist for 45 years. He was the ultimate authority, the spiritual and political anchor of the entire incredibly complex Iranian system.
The military, the IRGC, the clerics, they all ultimately answered to him.
To lose him in the middle of a hot war with Israel and the U.S. creates an immense vacuum of power.
He was immediately succeeded by his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, a shadowy figure who controlled the Supreme Leader's office behind the scenes, but lacked his father's deep religious authority and widespread respect among the clerical establishment.
And that transition was anything but smooth. The sources draw a direct line connecting this wartime weakness, the death of the long-standing leader, and the economic devastation, straight into massive internal upheaval.
The Iranian public saw a weak, transitional government that had just failed to protect the homeland from a massive bombing campaign, while simultaneously making the economy unlivable.
By January 2026, the streets of Iran were quite literally on fire.
We are talking about the largest, most sustained domestic protests since the 1979 revolution itself.
This wasn't just a dispute over a specific policy or economic grievance. Hundreds of thousands of citizens poured into the streets in Tehran, Isfahan, and regional capitals, explicitly chanting death to Khamenei.
They were openly demanding an end to the Islamic Republic entirely. Women were burning their hijabs, students were clashing with the riot police.
And the new government's response, terrified of losing power, was a brutal, uncompromising, and highly lethal crackdown by the IRGC and the Bazi militia.
The intelligence estimates point to thousands of civilian deaths. The internet was blacked out. The international community watched in horror.
Trump even openly supported the protesters on social media, threatening further military intervention if the Iranian government continued slaughtering peaceful demonstrators.
Look at the terrifying picture we have painted here. It is early 2026. Iran's prized multi-billion-dollar nuclear sites have just been bombed by the U.S. and Israel.
Their supreme leader of 45 years is dead, replaced by a son struggling to consolidate power. The general population is in a massive, deadly, widespread revolt against the very existence of the government.
And the economy is utterly crushed by years of maximum pressure sanctions.
By absolutely every conventional metric of political science, this regime should be collapsing inward, turning on itself and begging for a ceasefire.
And yet they don't.
How on earth does a regime with its nuclear sites cratered and its own streets burning manage to pivot back to playing aggressive geopolitical offense?
Because of that stubbornly ingrained institutional memory we discussed regarding the Iran-Iraq War. Survival at all costs.
Wow.
When an autocratic regime is backed into a corner, facing both domestic overthrow and military humiliation, they do not surrender to the West. Surrender means the death of the leadership.
Instead, they deploy their ultimate weapon. They shift the battlefield to a domain where they hold the absolute advantage.
They remind the world that if they are going down, they have the capacity to drag the entire global economy down into the abyss with them.
Which catapults us into the terrifying escalations of early 2026. The United States smelled blood in the water.
They saw an Iranian regime weakened by strikes, fractured by protests, and led by a new, unproven supreme leader.
Washington decided it was time to finish the job and permanently defang the Iranian military apparatus.
In February 2026, the U.S. military launched Operation Epic Fury.
The intelligence breakdown outlines the official objectives mandated by the Trump administration. It was a massive, surprise kinetic attack meant to permanently destroy Iran's remaining ballistic missile arsenal
Annihilate their naval capabilities in the Persian Gulf.
and completely dismantle their ability to fund, arm, and coordinate their proxy terrorist groups across the region.
So Iran is getting pounded again. They are bereft of a strong blue water navy to fight the American destroyers.
Their air force relies on obsolete jets from the 1970s that are easily shot down. Their missile launch sites are being actively hunted by U.S. stealth bombers.
In a conventional fight, they're totally outmatched. So how do they respond to epic fury?
They turn to the one weapon no bomb can ever destroy: geography.
This is the dark genius and the absolute terror of asymmetric warfare. Iran knew they couldn't match U.S. firepower in the sky, so they abandoned the sky entirely.
They went to the water, they unleashed a purely economic weapon, they fully activated the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's break down the mechanics of this, because it's not just a declaration on paper. It involves terrifyingly effective low-cost tactics.
They start dropping hundreds of naval mines into those 3-kilometer shipping lanes we talked about earlier.
A mine costs a few $1,000s, but it can blow a massive hole in a $100 million tanker carrying $100 million worth of oil.
Next, they launch anti-ship cruise missiles from mobile launchers hidden along the jagged, mountainous coastline. They shoot and then hide in caves before U.S. jets can spot them.
And then they deploy swarm tactics.
Swarm tactics are the nightmare of modern naval commanders.
An American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is a $2 billion marvel of technology. Its Aegis combat system is designed to track and shoot down highly advanced hypersonic ballistic missiles in space.
But it is fundamentally vulnerable if it is suddenly attacked by 50 cheap fiberglass speedboats rushing at it from every direction simultaneously.
Right, armed with heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades.
The radar gets cluttered. The automated defense guns simply can't shoot fast enough to hit every small target before one gets close enough to do damage.
It is a terrifying mismatch of high-tech defense overwhelmed by sheer volume of low-tech aggression.
And the Iranians didn't just stop at harassing ships in the water. The sources detail a rapid expansion of their target list to hit regional infrastructure.
They launched waves of explosive suicide drones to strike Kuwaiti oil refineries and the massive Kuwait Petroleum Corporation headquarters.
They hit critical telecommunication buildings and shipping ports in the United Arab Emirates. They were demonstrating that nowhere in the Gulf was safe.
And remember the insurance companies we discussed.
Oh, yeah. As soon as the first mines were spotted and the drones hit the refineries, the insurance markets panicked.
They fled the region entirely. The Persian Gulf officially became an uninsurable no-go zone for global shipping.
Millions of barrels of oil abruptly stopped flowing. The massive global economic shockwave we outlined earlier, gasoline rocketing to $4.30 a gallon, the terrifying spike in inflation, the threat of an immediate global recession.
This is the exact moment it hits.
But Iran, fully committed to this strategy of chaos, didn't just play the Hormuz card. They brought out a second, arguably even more disruptive threat to leverage against the world.
The sources point to a highly publicized, chilling warning from a senior Iranian advisor named Ali Akbar Veliati.
He looked at the chaos in Hormuz and told the international press, "We can target the Bab al-Mandeb Strait as well."
Expanding the threat to the Bab al-Mandeb Strait is a masterstroke of asymmetric pressure.
Because Bab al-Mandeb is another geographic bottleneck.
It is the critical choke point between the coast of Yemen and the Horn of Africa. Crucially, it is the southern entrance to the Red Sea, which leads directly to the Suez Canal.
Roughly 10% of total global maritime trade passes through there, including massive amounts of consumer goods from Asia heading to Europe.
And who controls the rugged ground right next to that strait?
The Houthi militant group in Yemen.
A group that is heavily funded, armed with advanced anti-ship ballistic missiles, and directed by Iran.
So Iran is essentially standing on the world stage and saying, we have already closed the world's main oil driveway in the Persian Gulf. If you keep dropping bombs on our infrastructure, we will use our proxies to close the world's main commercial highway in the Red Sea.
We will stop the oil, and we will stop the cargo ships. We will freeze the entire global economy.
If we synthesize Iran's grand strategy here, the psychological game plan becomes crystal clear.
Iran knows, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they cannot militarily defeat the United States, but they know they don't have to.
They just have to defeat the U.S. voter.
That is a fascinating distinction. In a democratic system, political leaders are ultimately beholden to the electorate.
The Iranian strategy is simple. Make the economic cost of continuing this war absolutely unbearable for the average American.
If the American public suddenly finds themselves paying $6 for a gallon of gas to get to work,
If their winter heating bills triple overnight.
if the stock market crashes, wiping out their retirement accounts because global supply chains are frozen by Iranian mines and Houthi missiles.
The public will inevitably revolt against the war. The immense, crushing domestic political pressure on Washington to end the conflict, to negotiate, to retreat, will become insurmountable.
Iran is betting its very existence that American political patience will run out long before Iranian regime's stubbornness does.
It's exactly like a perfectly executed judo throw in martial arts.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, Iran is using the immense heavy weight of the U.S. and global economy against itself. They don't have to be physically stronger than the U.S. military machine. They just have to stick their foot out and trip the U.S. economy.
The massive weight of the ensuing economic fall does all the devastating damage for them.
And it was this exact agonizing economic chokehold, this slow strangulation of the global markets, that directly provoked the unprecedented, furious rhetoric of April 2026.
The U.S. economy was screaming, the global markets were bleeding out. Washington felt it was losing control of the narrative.
And that brings us to the absolute climax of our timeline, the Easter ultimatum and the dollar's existential threat.
We are back to where we started, April 6th and 7th, 2026.
President Trump had been issuing a series of increasingly aggressive deadlines for Iran to clear the mines and open the strait, and Iran had been stoically ignoring them, absorbing the pressure.
Finally, the frustration boils over into the profanity-laced social media ultimatum.
Trump tweets, "Open the strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell," followed closely by the chilling line we opened this entire deep dive with.
A whole civilization will die tonight.
And the U.S. domestic reaction to a president threatening to erase a civilization, as detailed in the intelligence sources, was sharply and immediately divided along highly polarized lines.
Extremely divided. The sources show Democratic lawmakers reacting with absolute horror at the rhetoric.
Congresswoman Yasmin Ansari went on national television and called him a deranged lunatic.
Senator Angus King called the threats to carpet bomb civilian infrastructure the unhinged words of an immoral madman.
But on the other side of the aisle, Republicans strongly defended the president's aggressive posture. Their stance was grounded in the reality of the crisis. The global economy was being held hostage.
They argued that meeting strategic military objectives, breaking the blockade, and saving the U.S. economy from a catastrophic recession was an absolute necessity and required applying maximum terrifying leverage.
But the critical thing to understand is that it wasn't just empty political rhetoric meant for Twitter. There's an immediate kinetic reality to this threat.
In conjunction with the ultimatum, U.S. forces launched highly targeted bomber strikes on Karg Island.
Karg Island. And the vastness of the Persian Gulf, what makes that specific target so incredibly significant?
Karg Island is essentially the beating heart of the Iranian oil export economy. It is a small island located just off the coast, but it serves as the absolute nexus for their oil infrastructure. It is the primary, massive terminal where pipelines from the mainland converge and where the supertankers hook up to load Iranian crude.
Hitting Karg Island is hitting the Iranian regime right in the wallet, destroying their primary source of national revenue.
The U.S. bomber strikes successfully destroyed key military defenses on the island, killing 4 senior Iranian military officers in the process.
But, and this is a remarkably crucial detail of restraint, the U.S. pilots deliberately avoided direct hits on the massive oil storage tanks and loading facilities themselves.
So it's a massive fiery warning shot across the bow.
The U.S. is saying, look, we can completely destroy your ability to ever sell a drop of oil again, but we haven't pulled that final trigger yet. We are giving you a chance to back down.
Exactly. It brings both superpowers right to the very edge of the precipice, looking down into the abyss of total war.
And then, at the absolute 11th hour, an unexpected mediator steps in to pause the clock.
Yes, this was one of the most fascinating geopolitical details in the intelligence breakdown. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, frantically stepped in to mediate.
Pakistan is in a highly unique, deeply vulnerable position here.
They share a long, porous border with Iran. They have a complex, historically fraught relationship with the United States.
And as a developing nation, they would be utterly economically devastated by a prolonged closure of the strait and the resulting spike in energy prices.
Sharif managed to leverage his position to secure a 2-week diplomatic extension from Washington, pausing the immediate threat of total annihilation to give back-channel diplomacy one last desperate chance.
But instead of backing down and quietly clearing the mines during those 2 weeks of borrowed time, Iran executed what might be the single most consequential, disruptive move of the entire conflict.
A move that completely transitions this crisis from a regional military dispute over shipping lanes into a full-blown global financial war.
The Hormuz tolls. The sources reveal Iran's absolute masterstroke of geopolitical judo.
Iran abruptly announced to the world that they would indeed allow commercial ships to pass safely through the Strait of Hormuz. They would lift the blockade.
But they demanded a transit toll, a toll of $2 million per voyage for any commercial ship traversing the strait.
$2 million is a massive sum, but for a supertanker carrying over $100 million worth of oil, it is a fee the shipping companies would reluctantly pay to avoid being blown up.
But the true kicker, the absolute earth-shattering detail, wasn't the $2 million. It was the currency demanded.
Yes, Iran decreed that the toll was payable only in Chinese yuan. They explicitly refused to accept U.S. dollars.
This right here is the true high-stakes battle of 2026. This is where the tectonic plates of the global order shift under our feet.
Because demanding a transit fee in yuan for the world's most vital energy corridor is not just an economic annoyance for the West, it is a direct, highly calculated assassination attempt on the U.S. petrodollar system.
Okay, we absolutely must unpack this for the listener because petrodollar is a term thrown around on cable news a lot, but understanding the actual mechanics of it is vital to understanding why a toll in yuan fundamentally threatens the American way of life.
Definitely.
How exactly does the petrodollar system work, and why is this Iranian demand so dangerous for Washington?
To understand the petrodollar, we have to go back to the early 1970s. In 1971, President Nixon shocked the world by taking the U.S. dollar off the gold standard.
The dollar was suddenly just fiat currency, backed only by trust in the U.S. government.
To ensure the dollar remained the dominant global reserve currency, the Nixon administration, largely orchestrated by Henry Kissinger, struck a foundational secret agreement with Saudi Arabia.
Essentially, the United States promised to provide total military protection and weapons to the House of Saud.
In exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to price and sell all of their immense oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. And because Saudi Arabia led OPEC, the rest of the Middle Eastern oil producers quickly followed suit.
So the mechanics of this mean that if Japan or Germany or India wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia to fuel their economies, they cannot pay in Japanese yen or euros.
No, they have to go to the international currency markets, convert their native currency into U.S. dollars first, and then use those dollars to buy the oil.
Precisely. This brilliant arrangement guarantees that every single nation on Earth that needs to import energy, which is virtually all of them, must constantly hold massive multi-billion-dollar reserves of U.S. currency in their central banks.
Because there is this constant, immense, artificially mandated global demand for dollars just to buy basic energy, the value of the U.S. currency stays artificially high and incredibly stable.
Which gives the United States government to run massive multi-trillion-dollar deficits, endlessly print new money, and borrow debt at incredibly low interest rates without suffering from hyperinflation.
Why? Because the rest of the world is forced to absorb all those printed dollars just to buy their oil. The petrodollar is the invisible financial engine that funds American economic dominance and pays for the massive U.S. military machine.
So when Iran steps up to the microphone in 2026 and forces the world's shipping companies to buy Chinese yuan to pay the $2 million Hormuz toll,
they are intentionally creating a massive artificial global demand for the Chinese yuan instead of the U.S. dollar.
they are loudly demonstrating to the entire world, and specifically to the neighboring Middle Eastern oil producers, that the dollar is no longer the mandatory, unquestioned currency for energy transit.
They are proving that an alternative system exists. If the massive energy trade in the Persian Gulf slowly begins to shift from dollars to yuan, the foundational pillar of the petrodollar collapses.
The domino effect of that is terrifying for America. If the world doesn't need dollars to buy oil, central banks dump their dollar reserves.
The demand for the U.S. dollar plummets, the value of the currency crashes, domestic inflation in America would absolutely explode.
And the U.S. government's ability to effortlessly borrow money to fund its global military dominance would evaporate overnight.
Which is why President Trump's reaction to this toll demand, as documented in the sources, is so incredibly revealing.
He didn't just issue a legalistic statement saying, you are violating the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. You cannot restrict freedom of navigation.
Trump flatly stated, Iran doesn't have the right to collect tolls. We want to collect them.
That statement strips away every ounce of diplomatic veneer.
Completely. It is a moment of raw, unvarnished geopolitical truth. It proves that this entire conflict, at its absolute core, isn't really about freedom of navigation or upholding international maritime law.
It's about who owns the toll booth. It is about who gets to control the vital choke point of the global economy.
If the United States collects the tolls or ensures the waterway remains free under the umbrella of U.S. naval dominance, the dollar remains supreme.
If Iran successfully collects them in yuan, the global financial order fundamentally shifts east.
Which brings us perfectly to synthesizing the grand picture. Because to truly grasp the magnitude of the 2026 crisis, we have to zoom out and look at the overarching existential motivations driving the three main actors in this drama.
The United States, Israel, and Iran. This is what the analysts refer to as the triangle of survival. Let's start with the United States.
According to the breakdown, the U.S. goals are multifaceted and largely imperial in nature. They want to maintain absolute control over the vital global oil routes.
They desperately need to protect dollar hegemony and the petrodollar system from collapse.
They want to actively fracture the emerging dangerous alliance between Iran, Russia, and China.
And ultimately, their long-term strategic goal is complete regime change in Tehran, replacing the hostile clerics with a friendly government, which would finally grant Western oil companies access to those 155 billion barrels of proven Iranian oil reserves.
Now, contrast those broad global economic goals with Israel's motivations. Israel's focus is far more singular, immediate, and visceral.
Their actions are driven by absolute existential dread. Their primary overriding goal is ensuring that Iran never, ever obtains a functional nuclear weapon.
Because the Iranian leadership has historically, repeatedly threatened Israel's very existence, referring to it as a cancerous tumor.
Furthermore, Israel desperately wants to permanently dismantle what they call the Ring of Fire, the massive proxy networks of Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and militias in Syria that Iran uses to physically encircle, rocket, and bleed Israel on a daily basis.
And the expert analysis in our sources points out a massive, heavily guarded paradox here regarding Israel's nuclear panic. Israel's terrified of a nuclear-armed Iran, yet Israel itself possesses a robust, undeclared nuclear arsenal.
It is an open secret globally. Everyone knows they have the bomb. But Israel maintains a strict policy of nuclear ambiguity, never officially confirming or denying its arsenal.
So we're looking at a volatile region where one player already has the ultimate weapon in secret and is willing to launch preemptive regional wars to guarantee the other side never gets it.
And then, completing the triangle, you have Iran. We have traced their deep motivations all the way from the trauma of 1953 to the battlefields of today.
Their singular overriding goal is the preservation and survival of their regime.
They pursue a massive nuclear program to achieve the ultimate deterrence against a Western invasion.
They heavily leverage their geography and the Strait of Hormuz to inflict catastrophic economic pain when threatened.
And strategically, they are not acting alone. They are actively, aggressively seeking deeper alignment with the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Their goal is to help build a multipolar world order that completely bypasses and neutralizes Western financial and military dominance.
And so when we map out this grand triangle, you instantly see where the massive frictions lie.
Yes. You see how the goals of the United States and Israel sometimes align tactically, but fundamentally diverge strategically.
The United States wants long-term regime change, containment of China, and total control of the macro oil markets.
Israel doesn't necessarily care about who controls the global oil trade or the petrodollar. They just want the immediate physical, nuclear, and proxy threats neutralized right now to ensure their physical survival tomorrow.
While Iran is fighting a complex, multi-front war for its life, they are fighting Israel militarily via their proxies, but they are fighting the United States economically.
They are essentially acting as the vanguard, the tip of the spear, for an emerging multipolar world alongside heavyweights like Russia and China that desperately wants to dethrone the U.S. dollar and end American hegemony once and for all.
It is a profound, incredibly dangerous, intricately interwoven web of pure survival instincts clashing in the most volatile region on Earth.
We have been on an absolute epic journey today through this intelligence breakdown.
We started way back in 1953, watching the CIA and MI6 orchestrate the overthrow of a democratic Iranian prime minister simply to maintain control of his nation's oil.
We saw how that covert action planted a deep, bitter seed of trauma that ultimately birthed the fiercely anti-Western 1979 Islamic Revolution.
We tracked how that trauma, reinforced by the horrors of chemical weapons in the 1980s, drove Iran to stubbornly build a massive nuclear shield.
We watched that building tension finally explode into the kinetic violence of the 2025 12-day war, with bunker busters raining down on underground nuclear sites, coinciding with the destabilizing death of a 45-year supreme leader.
And we analyzed how a cornered, economically devastated, militarily outmatched regime responded in 2026, not by surrendering to the pressure, but by brilliantly leveraging their geography.
They mined the Strait of Hormuz, utilized drone swarms, cut off 20% of the world's daily oil supply, and effectively weaponized global inflation to break the political will of the American voter.
Leading us right back to that terrifying Easter Sunday morning in 2026. A civilization-ending standoff over a $2 million transit toll payable exclusively in Chinese yuan.
A direct, calculated attack on the foundational petrodollar that provoked an American president to threaten the total erasure of a 7,000-year-old nation.
And this entire complex narrative is exactly why you, the listener, must care about geopolitics.
The price you pay to fill up your car for your commute, the purchasing power of the money sitting in your savings account, the stability of the global stock markets that hold your retirement fund. These are not abstract, untouchable economic concepts.
Right now, your financial reality is being held hostage by a 34-kilometer stretch of salty water near Oman and 70 years of incredibly bad blood.
It is wild to think about how interconnected it all is.
And honestly, analyzing all of this leaves me with one final, very provocative thought. It is something we haven't explicitly debated today, but it builds directly on everything we've just discussed about the petrodollar and asymmetric warfare.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think about the true nature of power in the 21st century. The United States undeniably possesses the most advanced, lethal, technologically superior military in human history.
Unquestionably.
They can launch stealth bombers to crater Natanz. They can launch precision strikes to obliterate the command centers on Karg Island. They can physically destroy almost any target on Earth.
Right.
But if the US dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency because of a regional conflict over an oil choke point, does that massive military supremacy even matter anymore? If you can easily win the physical, kinetic war, but your underlying currency collapses and your domestic economy burns to the ground in a hyperinflationary fire, who actually won the war?
That is the exact terrifying question, keeping military and economic strategists awake at night in Washington.
It is definitely a thing for you to mull over as you watch the news. Keep digging into the forces of de-dollarization and asymmetric warfare, because the battle for the Strait of Hormuz and the future of the global economy is a story that is far from over.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive as we unpacked the edge of the abyss. Until next time, stay curious.